In this video, we're shining the spotlight on the greatest attacking chess player, Paul Morphy, with 9 of his best ever games, all of which end in beautiful checkmates. Morphy starts e4 in the first game and is faced with e5. Knight f3 attacking the pawn is followed by knight c6 defending, and white plays bishop c4 the Italian game. Black develops his other knight, and white strikes in the center with d4. Black takes the pawn, and white doesn't recapture, instead jumping his knight to g5 to add a second attacker onto the soft f7 point. Black pushes d5, blocking the bishop's attack, and after white takes the pawn, black recaptures with his knight. White castles, looking to swiftly shift his rook onto the open e-file, and black lifts his bishop, blocking the file while looking to possibly take the knight. So white doesn't give him the chance, sacrificing his knight on f7 in fried liver style. To avoid loss of material, black has no choice but to take the knight, walking his king into a potent pin. White jumps his queen to f3, forking the king and the knight, and black's only way to save his knight is placing his king on e6 in the heat of a wild central battle. Morphy follows with the brilliant knight c3, adding an attacker to black's knight, but offering up his own knight, and black accepts the offer, taking it with his pawn. This, however, opens the d-file, and white could soon take advantage of that. For now, he shifts his rook to e1 with check, and either the king could slide over, which would give up the knight for free, or black could block with his other knight, which is what he does. White builds up pressure on the pinned piece with his bishop, and black defends it with bishop f6. White takes the knight, and black recaptures. Then, with surgical precision, Morphy plays the only move that wins the game, and a beautiful move at that. Rook takes e5. This sacrifices the exchange on top of the 2 knights he already sacrificed earlier, and black doesn't have any choice but to take the rook, because otherwise queen takes d5 would be checkmate. So black does take the rook, and white swings his other rook over with check. Black can't go back because queen takes d5 would be checkmate. So the king marches forward to d4. White grabs the knight, removing the defense of critical squares near the black king, and black taking back with the queen would lead to a swift checkmate of queen takes c3. So black swings his other rook over to e8. Now at this point, it's all over for black, as white has a remarkable way to win, albeit it's incredibly hard to spot the full combination to its conclusion. Can you find the checkmate in 7? Despite being down a full rook, white's 3 remaining pieces are enough to checkmate the black king, who has strayed a little too far forward for his own good. The move Morphy starts with is queen d3 check. The king's only safe square is c5, and the only winning move here for white is b4 check. The king can't go to d6 because returning the bishop to f3 would be checkmate. The other option would be going to b6, but white would be able to inch his queen closer and closer until he would force a checkmate on the rim. Going back, to delay things the longest, black takes the pawn. Queen c4 here would also work, but white plays queen d4 check, and the king could either go to a3 or to a5, but both outcomes would be the same. In the game, he chooses a5, and black takes the pawn with check, pushing the king to a4. Queen b3 check comes next, pushing the king back to a5, while confining him to one final file. Queen a3 check lets him out to b6, but it doesn't matter because with the queen and the bishop locking the king up on the b file, rook b1 is checkmate. Morphy has the black pieces for the second game, and he meets e4 with e5. Knight f3 attacks the pawn, so black defends with knight c6, and white plays bishop c4 the Italian game. Black replies with bishop c5, and white offers the Evans gambit with b4, using Morphy's own weapon against him. Black accepts the gambit, taking it with his bishop. This lessens black's control over the center, and white can continue with c3, hitting the bishop while preparing a central advance. Black drops his bishop a square, keeping a watchful eye on the enemy king, and white lunges with d4, opening his queenside minor pieces. Black takes the pawn, and white cannot recapture with his pawn because of the pin. Instead, he plays e5, preventing black from developing his knight. After black plays d5, opening his queenside bishop, while hitting white's bishop, white takes the pawn en passant, and black recaptures with the queen before white castles. Morphy follows with knight g to e7, anticipating a rook check on the open e-file. White instead plays knight g5, going after the frail f7 pawn, but black defends it by castling. White drops his bishop to d3, targeting the h7 pawn next, and black develops his bishop to f5, blocking the attack. White takes it, and after black recaptures with his knight, white lifts his bishop to a3, skewering the queen and the rook. Black counters with queen g6, hitting the knight. Once white takes the rook, black takes the knight in return, and despite being down the exchange with no concrete attack just yet, black does have a couple pieces near the enemy king, with more soon to come. White still has to save his bishop, and he returns it to a3 before black wins the pawn on c3. White sets up for the next game with bishop c1. This does hit the queen though, so black drops her to g6. White brings his bishop out to f4, and black centralizes his rook on d8 with an attack on white's queen. She swerves to c2, and black jumps his knight from c to d4, hitting her again. The poor queen jumps to e4, only for Morphy to play one of the nicest moves you may have ever seen him play. Knight g3, hitting the queen again in two different ways. Although black's knight is hanging, by moving it, black has opened a discovered attack on white's queen, who is also hanging. So white can't take the knight without losing the queen. And were he to move the queen anywhere, he would at the very least give back the exchange. So white takes black's queen, giving black a way to finish up the game on the spot. Can you find black's checkmate in one? Not only was knight g3 attacking multiple pieces, but it was also covering the h1 square, and with the white queen gone, she has left loose a critical square. The move Morphy plays to end the game is knight d to e2, checkmate. In the third game, Morphy starts e4. After e5, he fires out f4, the king's gambit. Black accepts, and in doing so, cedes control over the center. White continues knight f3, both developing and preventing queen h5, which would suck. And black plays d5, aiming to catch up in development by opening lines for his pieces, rather than trying to keep the extra pawn. It also forces white to waste a move, dealing with the tension in the center, which in this case results in white capturing the pawn. Black develops the bishop to e7 with the idea of playing bishop h4 check. White follows with bishop b4 check, enticing black to play c6. White captures the pawn, and black has the option to develop his knight, but white would immediately castle. So instead, black captures with the pawn to attack the bishop. After it moves, black follows through with his plan of bishop h4 check. Next, Morphy unveils a surprising and potent move. g3. Black captures and white castles into a seemingly tumultuous kingside. Yet within this chaos, order prevails. The king escapes the center, and the rook and the bishop unite on f7, ready for an onslaught. Black takes the last pawn with check, and white does not recapture. He plays king h1, taking shelter behind what is known as an umbrella pawn. Black can't attack their own pawn, so it actually serves as a valiant defender to the white king. Now white's threat is to take the bishop, opening a discovered attack on f7. So black retreats the bishop to f6, blocking the file. Knight e5 comes next, and this is a tricky move. It adds an attacker to f7, and should it be taken, it would open the rook's attack onto f7. However, this was a bluff by white. Black could actually take the knight, and although white could take on f7, he doesn't have enough pieces out ready for an attack. Black would have time to consolidate and simply be up a piece. Going back, staring into Morphy's poker face, black flinches, choosing to defend his pawn with knight h6. White's d4 defends his knight while opening the bishop's eyes. Black takes on e4, and here Morphy decides that it's been long enough. It's time to go for the enemy king. Queen h5, the threat being to take twice on f7 with checkmate. Here black plays the best move, queen takes d5, defending his bishop who was also under attack, while giving his king an escape square. White follows by taking twice on f7, and after king d8 dodging, white plays bishop g5 check. The only move here for black is bishop f6 blocking. Then white plays knight c3, bringing more pieces into play and threatening the devastating rook d1, which would pin and win the queen. Now black should take on g5 here, with the clever resource of meeting rook a to d1 with bishop d2. He didn't see that, unfortunately, instead playing bishop d7, which also meets the threat of rook a to d1. But there was another threat. With the a rook now defending white's back rank, the other rook is free to leave. And it does. It takes the bishop on f6. It cannot be recaptured because of the resulting double attack on the king and the queen. So, black gets out of the way of any discovered checks with king to c7. Morphy begins his final combination as bishop f4 check puts the king on the run. Then rook d6 forks the bishop and the queen. After black's queen dodges, Morphy doesn't even take the bishop, playing knight e4 instead, bringing more pieces near the king while attacking the queen. After the queen moves, rook takes d7 check comes. The knight takes it and the queen recaptures, sending the black king scrambling. Knight d3 comes even closer to the king, and black plays rook h to d8, attacking white's queen. White's queen swings over to b7, pushing the king to a5, where he will soon meet his inevitable fate, since white has a way to win. Can you find the checkmate in 3? White just needs to push the black king a little further down the board, and he'll soon run out of squares. The move Morphy starts with is the stunning sacrifice, bishop d2 check. If the queen doesn't take the bishop, then queen b4 would be checkmate. So black takes the bishop, surrendering control of the c4 square, where the knight jumps in, giving another check. After the king moves, white doesn't even take the black queen who is hanging, because there's something better. b3 checkmate. In the fourth game, Morphy starts e4 and is faced with e5. Knight f3 attacking the pawn is met by d6 defending. Then white strikes with d4. White's threatening to take on e5 so that he can exchange queens next and force the black king to go uncastled. So black takes the pawn, allowing white to bring the queen into the game early on. Black attacks her with knight c6, but white pins the knight to its even more valuable king. Black breaks the pin with bishop d7, so white takes the knight, and after black recaptures with the bishop, white develops his bishop to g5, hitting the black queen. f6 blocks the attack while pushing the bishop back to h4. Then black develops his knight to h6, looking to jump forward in the future. Morphy proceeds development with knight c3 before black plays bishop e7 and both sides castle kingside. White shifts the queen a square, giving check, and after the king dodges, he jumps his knight to the vacated d4 square, where it prepares to jump forward with a fork on the queen and the rook. Black gets out of danger with queen d7 before white slides his rook over from a to d1. Black, probably wanting to avoid his rook getting hit, preemptively moves it to f7. White presses on with f4, gaining space on the king side, and after a5, he continues f5. Black, realizing that his rook looks kinda silly on f7, returns it back to f8. Once white plays knight e6, the rook is able to evade the attack, moving to g8, where it can help protect the king side. White follows with a4, stopping black from expanding further on the queen side, with b5. Before black jumps his knight to g4, trying to activate it. Morphy drops his queen to e2, hitting the loose knight, who quickly hops to e5. White then wants to lift his rook up and over, but the black knight is stopping that. So white moves his bishop to g3, where it can snatch the knight on the next move. Black drops his queen to c8 because he also wants to return his bishop to get rid of white's knight. White takes the knight, and after black recaptures, he lifts his rook to f3, preparing to swing it over to the h-file. Black continues his plan to capture the knight with bishop d7, and white moves his rook to h3, where it peers the confined black king. Black pushes h6 as the black king gasps for air. But Morphy's eyes light up at the sight of this move as he shifts his queen a square, where she coordinates with the rook on h6 to threaten a checkmate in two, namely taking with the rook first, and after the recapture, queen takes h6 would be checkmate. White also is creating a battery on the d-file that hits the bishop. Black has no choice but to stop the greater of the two problems by lifting his king to defend the pawn, and white swipes the bishop, going up material. Black tries to be a little fancy, moving the bishop to d6, where it cuts off the rook and queen's connection. But black is in serious trouble, since white has a way to put an end to the game on the spot. Can you find the checkmate in 6? The bishop moving means that the white queen now pins the g-pawn to the king. And you might wonder, what's the point of that? Well, Morphy's answer to that is rook takes h6. Black's only choice is to recapture with the king because he can't take back with the pawn, and this leaves the king naked on the edge of the board. White's other rook jumps to d3, looking to avenge his fallen companion, with a threat of checkmate on h3. Now, to force the longest possible checkmate, black could move his bishop to c5 with check. After the king would dodge, he would interfere with the rook sliding over with bishop e3. White would take it, and black could then advance his king to h5, but white would play rook h3 check, followed by king g5 and queen d1, checkmate. Back to the game. Black instead moves his king to h5 to avoid the immediate checkmate on h3, but this gives white a slightly quicker checkmate with queen f7 check. Black has several options here. King h6 would be met by rook h3 checkmate right away. g6 would see queen h7 check, king g4, and h3 checkmate. King g4 would be met by queen g6, king h4, and rook h3 checkmate. Finally, what happens in the game is king h4. Morphy finishes things up with rook h3 check, pushing the king to g4, where he gets checkmated by the white queen on h5. The fifth opponent is Mr. Knight, and when faced with the king's gambit, he accepts it. Morphy's knight f3 is met with the materialistic g5. Bishop c4 develops while pressuring the soft f7. Queen e7 attacks e4, but white does not defend it, going for d4. This is because black capturing the pawn would give white a promising initiative after king f2 and later a move like rook to e1. Going back, black plays d5 instead, opening his light-squared bishop's eyes with tempo, only to forget that after bishop takes d5, that b7 pawn still needs protection. So black plays c6. At this point, Morphy notices that black is far behind in development. To capitalize on this, he plays bishop takes f7, which is a dubious sacrifice, but it introduces chaos into the position. The queen captures, becoming a target for the white knight, who jumps to e5, attacking her. Queen f6 is followed by queen h5 check, king e2, and then h4, starting to open up the king side. Black is in a tough spot here and decides to capture on h4. Morphy doesn't recapture, instead castling his king into the chaos while also adding an extra attacker onto the f-pawn. Bishop h6 hangs onto the pawn for dear life before white plays the brutal b3. After knight to d7, white's bishop snipes the king from long range, and black blocks the attack with c5. Morphy follows with rook d1 in anticipation of the opening of the d-file. Black captures the knight, which abandons defense of the c5 pawn, allowing the bishop to take it with check. The king avoids the rook's gaze on the d-file by moving forward to e6. Queen e8 check is blocked with knight e7, and here, white has one move to win the game. Can you find the checkmate in one? The move is d5 checkmate. And yes, Morphy just won in 17 moves without a rook or a knight. John Cholton has the white pieces for game 6 and he starts e4. Morphy replies e5, and as was the style of the time, white plays the king's gambit. Black in aggressive fashion counters with d5, offering a pawn of his own. White takes on d5 and the e-pawn is still hanging, so black uses the vacated square to push it, gaining space. White's knight c3 hits the pawn and black develops his knight to f6 defending. After d3 challenging the advanced pawn, black jumps his bishop to b4, undermining white's control over the center. White breaks the pin before black thrusts forward with e3, sacrificing a pawn. This gives black some time to get ahead in development because after white takes the pawn and he castles, his rook is itching to shift a square, making an irritating pin on that bishop, who white opts to duck out of the way in advance. Morphy captures the knight, and while white could recapture with the bishop, he decides to take with the pawn, which he could later use to exert pressure over the center. The d-pawn is also hanging, but black first gives a check with rook e8, and after the bishop blocks, he piles up on the pinned piece with bishop g4. White plays c4 defending his pawn, and black pushes c6. This threatens to take twice on d5, and the thing is, white can't do anything to not lose the pawn. He doesn't realize this, however, as he captures the pawn, allowing black to develop by recapturing, and that knight is about to jump to d4, adding another attacker to the indefensible bishop on e2. It looks like white could stop that, but a move like c3 wouldn't work because it hangs the d3 pawn thanks to the pin on the bishop, and white's whole position would collapse shortly after. Another move, like bishop c3, would be a good try, but black would jump his knight to d4 anyways. After white would take it, black would recapture with the queen, and the threat now is to take multiple times on e2, which would eventually force the queen to recapture and leave the defense of the hanging rook in the corner. White would have to move the rook to stop this, but then black would eventually sacrifice the exchange on e2 and then move his other rook over to e8, pinning the knight, who can't be defended. Back to the game. White instead shifts his king over to f1, breaking the pin so that he can move his bishop. Morphy sacrifices his rook on e2 because once white recaptures with the knight, now it's pinned by the bishop to the queen. Then black jumps his knight to d4, threatening to win the piece, and white has no more defensive resources. He moves his queen out of the way because bishop takes e2 would have been a fork. Black takes the knight that he worked so hard to win with a check that pushes the king to f2. He jumps his knight to g4, giving another check that pushes the king to g1, at which point his fate has already been decided. Black has a wonderful way to win the game. Can you find the checkmate in 7? Black has many pieces surrounding the white king, and white's pieces are doing very little to stop the attack. Black wants to get his queen involved without giving white a chance to reorganize his pieces, and the move Morphy plays to achieve that is the stunning sacrifice, knight f3 check. White's king has no moves, so he's forced to capture the knight, and black is then able to make use of the vacated square on d4 to give check with his queen. Blocking with the bishop would only speed up the mate, so white dodges the king to g2. The queen swoops into f2, forcing the king to h3, before the queen takes on f3, pushing the king to h4. Now the knight is going to move, and it can either go to e3 or to h6, as long as it can move to f5 next. Now black chooses h6, and the threat is queen g4 checkmate. White stops that with queen g1 before the knight jumps to f5 with check. The king's only choice is g5, and black finishes things up with queen h5 checkmate. In the 7th game, Morphy starts e4, and after e5, he attacks the pawn with knight f3. Knight c6 defends before white moves his bishop to c4, and black plays copycat with bishop c5. White offers the Evans gambit with b4, which black accepts. White proceeds with c3. Black plays bishop c5, and white castles. After black's d6, white thrusts forward with d4, and black retreats his bishop to b6. White captures the pawn on e5, opening up the center. Black recaptures with his pawn, and white then plays queen b3, putting pressure on the f7 square. Black defends with queen f6. Morphy could play bishop g5 here, developing with tempo, but first he plays bishop b5, pinning the knight to the king. Now bishop g5 would be even stronger because it could win the e5 pawn. Black responds with bishop e6, developing his bishop with tempo. White piles up on the pinned knight with queen a4, and black plays knight g to e7 to add a defender. Now white strikes with bishop g5. Black's response, queen g6, is met by capturing the knight, forcing black to recapture with the king. Morphy then captures the other knight, giving black doubled pawns after he recaptures, and white proceeds to win the pawn back while attacking the queen. Black moves his queen back to f6, white delivers a check with knight takes c6, and here's a question for you. Would you play king to e8 as black? Because in this case, it's the only saving move. Surprisingly, there aren't really any good discovered checks, and other than being down a pawn, black would be okay. Instead, like any other reasonable person, black plays king f8, not walking into any discovered checks. Morphy follows up with e5, attacking the queen. Black plays queen g5, and white plays h4, deflecting the queen away from the defense of the e7 square. And here's why we notice that the king was actually better placed on e8. The move white plays is queen a3 check, forcing the king to g8, since going to e8 would lead to queen e7 checkmate. So the king moves to g8, and at this point, white has a way to still put black out of his misery. Can you find the checkmate in 4? You may have seen this famous pattern before, but if not, let Morphy show you his magic. The move he starts with is knight e7 check. After king to f8, he follows up with knight g6 check, a double check actually, driving the king back to g8. The stunning queen f8 check comes next, forcing black's rook to capture the sacrificed queen. Finally, Morphy finishes the game up with a beautiful smothered checkmate. In the penultimate game, Morphy starts e4, and after e5, knight f3, knight c6, he plays the Italian game with bishop c4. After bishop c5, white pushes b4, offering a pawn which black accepts. Then he plays c3, hitting the bishop, who retreats to a5. d4 comes next in an attempt to open the center, and black obliges, capturing the pawn before white castles his king, preparing to activate his rook. Black takes a second pawn on c3 with his bishop, and white captures it with his knight. After black recaptures, white develops his bishop to a3, where it cuts off the black's king's path to short castling. So black plays d6, blunting the bishop's diagonal while opening up his own bishop. Morphy follows with queen b3, creating a battery aimed at the fragile f7 square, and black defends it with knight h6, putting him a move away from castling kingside. White takes on c3, threatening the g7 pawn, and black decides to lift his queen to f6 to defend while offering a queen exchange. White wants none of that as he pushes his e-pawn a square, sacrificing a third pawn. Black takes it with his pawn, reopening the white's bishop's diagonal before white shifts his rook over to the semi-open e-file. Since black can't castle kingside anymore, he develops his bishop to d7, preparing to go the other direction. In anticipation, white shifts his rook from a to b1, bearing down on the black queenside. After white castles long, white swoops his bishop to a6, hoping for a capture that would open the b file so that he can then create a battery along it with his queen and rook. Now black could survive the ensuing attack with precise play, but things would become chaotic. Instead, black declines the sacrifice, jumping his knight to a5 to defend his pawn that was under attack twice. Were white to capture the knight, then black could capture the bishop with his queen, avoiding the big attack. But white doesn't take the knight, instead sliding his other rook over to the c file with a checkmate threat on c7. The problem for black now is that however he chooses to block the threat, white would be able to take the hanging knight next. Even blocking with the queen wouldn't be good because white would take the knight, and the queen wouldn't be able to move because there's still a threat of checkmate on c7. Going back, black chooses to block with the bishop, which is the best choice, albeit there weren't really any good choices. Morphy captures the knight, and black, trying to keep things in the balance, takes the bishop. White grabs the pawn with check, pushing the king to d7. Then he takes the bishop on c6 with his rook, knowing that were black to take it with his queen, then knight takes e5 would be a royal fork. So black saves his queen, moving her to f5. White stunningly sacrifices his rook on c7, since were black to take it, queen b7 would be checkmate. So black's king is forced to e8. Queen c6 check comes next, and blocking with the rook would lead to rook b8 checkmate. So black miserably blocks with the queen. White swoops his rook to the back rank, adding insult to injury, as black can't take it without hanging his full queen and an ensuing checkmate. So black takes the white queen. At this point, white has an amazing winning combination. Can you find the checkmate in 3? The white pieces are swarming the black king, and his ill fate will soon come to fruition. The move Morphy plays to end the game is rook e7 check. The king is forced to f8 away from the defense of the rook, which white takes next with another check. Black can only block with the queen, after which white takes it with his rook, giving checkmate. To finish things up, here's a poem I wrote about Paul Morphy's most famous game. This is a small story about a game played by Paul Morphy, with not just one adversary, but two men of the bourgeoisie. Will noble Duke Karl and the aristocrat Count Isouard survive? It's a night at the opera, and it starts e4, e5. Morphy plays knight f3, and black d6, Philidor's defense. White strikes with d4, and tension in the center becomes immense. What follows is a pin on the knight to the invaluable queen. Then the pawn captures on e5 with an infallible scheme. If a recapture, then white would exchange a queen for a queen, freeing the knight who would gobble the pawn like it's fine cuisine. So black takes on f3, inviting the white queen to the game. A rush of relief, material is even, the rivals claim. A new piece emerges as white poses a complex question. The bishop and queen converge at the soft point that is f7. Black knight to f6 obstructs the queen's line of sight, so the white queen jumps to b3, flaunting its divine might. A double attack on two puny pawns, you can only keep one. Yet Morphy rejects the material, the assault has just begun. Black leaps at the opportunity to keep the game within reach. Meanwhile, white's infantry is almost completely unleashed. Black plays the bold b5, maybe they caught white slacking. But to their shock, white captures the pawn, a knight sacking. The bishop makes first contact with the enemy king check. Black scuffles and soon winds up in a bewildering wreck. White trades rook for knight, then the final piece joins the fight. Black tries to untangle, but of course, Morphy does not bite. Bishop captures rook, knight recaptures, then queen to b8. She won't die in vain, only two remain, rook d8 checkmate. Thanks everyone for watching. If you want a chess.com membership, you can support me by purchasing it using my link in the description. As always, I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.